Working effectively with Japanese counterparts, Module 2, Communication Style, Screencast 2, Verbal and Non-Verbal Communication and Conveying Information. Indirect communication is closely tied to non-verbal communication, as this next case study shows. Antoine Laurent, a sales director, was in a negotiation with a Japanese company regarding the possibility of a joint venture. After various explanations, Antoine quoted a financial figure that would be an important criteria of the proposed joint venture. After hearing this number, the Japanese chief negotiator sat silently with what looked like a frown on his face and his arms folded. Thinking that he was dissatisfied with the number that had been proposed, Antoine quickly added that the number was negotiable and did not have to be agreed upon immediately. Antoine makes a common mistake here. He assumes that silence is something negative. But his Japanese counterpart may simply have been thinking, or listening, or both. Silence in conversation is not viewed negatively in Japan, as it is in many more talkative cultures. It may be ambiguous, but it is also powerful and profound. Here's another example of the way non-verbal communication works. At a Japanese university where there are many foreign exchange students, a Japanese visiting professor holding some lecture materials asked her class where the photocopier was. The non-Japanese students replied it was located on the second floor. While the non-Japanese students were saying this, the two Japanese students in the class stood up, got the materials from the professor, and went out to photocopy them. This case study offers another example of a Japanese person saying one thing, but leaving another part unsaid. The professor asked where the photocopier is, but what she presumably really meant was, "Could somebody please make these photocopies for me?" The Japanese students picked up on her intention immediately, while the non-Japanese students were trying to answer the question she actually asked. When working with Japanese colleagues, it is important to look beyond the words themselves and think about what other meanings might be intended. We have already seen that silence plays a very different role in Japanese conversation than most of us are used to. It's not only positive, but necessary. It gives the listener time to see how the other person will react and choose her words carefully. Interrupting is not accepted in Japanese culture. People wait for silences as a signal that it's okay to offer their own thoughts. Talk is considered cheap. It's easy to talk a lot, but to speak little requires more thought. Often, the most quiet person in a meeting is the most powerful one. Quiet, modest people are seen as more mature. There is an expression in Japanese, hear one, understand 10. That is, if you are told one thing, you will understand 10 implications. 90% of what is being said is not being stated in words. The burden is on the listener to make the effort to read between the lines and draw conclusions based on both non-verbal cues and shared background information. A manager will think, my employee should know what I mean just by looking at my face. Because Japanese people are always trying so hard to figure out what others are thinking, they watch them carefully and cultivate what they refer to as a kind of sixth sense that they have. Many Japanese people take great pride in the almost telepathic way they communicate with each other. People often send many subtle cues to those they work with. But outside of Japan, these cues are missed, and they get increasingly frustrated as they are forced to find ways to explain themselves explicitly. As one Japanese executive put it, the way one has to talk to children. For Japanese people, talking to those who have the ears to understand them, that would be a bit difficult means it's impossible, and it would be helpful if you're on time means don't be late. Because of these non-verbal and indirect ways of communicating, if you are working with a Japanese manager or colleague, you may not get the feedback you are used to receiving. In Japan, verbal feedback, whether negative or positive, is rarely given, so it can be difficult for those working with Japanese people to find out what they really think or want. In Japan, people are expected to figure things out without being explicitly told. Praising and complimenting are rare, and if you get negative feedback, there is usually more to the story than what is stated. Try to read between the lines, and asking for suggestions on how to improve your work is a good way to gently draw out feedback. Because Japanese people tend to communicate in indirect and non-verbal ways, how new things are taught can also be different from the way they are taught in other cultures. Here's an example. Sophia, an administrative assistant, is working with a software program and is having some difficulty with it. She knows that her Japanese supervisor is very proficient in this program, so she asks him to come over to assist her. He walks up and takes the mouse out of her hand in order to demonstrate to her the proper use of the program. She's quite offended by this. In Japan, People most often convey information by showing, not telling. Physical actions are demonstrated rather than explained, and learning happens through experience. Here's another example. The US employee's point of view is the company says it wants to transfer technology, but I don't see it happening. They never have any formal training classes, and there isn't even a manual. Whereas his Japanese colleague's response is, our philosophy is on-the-job training. Many cultures use structured, classroom-style learning on a set schedule based on theory and explanations. The emphasis is on universally applicable information, hence the value of recognized degrees and qualifications. In contrast, the Japanese model is more of an apprenticeship model, in which learning takes place through experience over a long period of time, through testing and training. Time spent at a company almost always results in increasing seniority, whatever an employee's performance is like. In this model, the company's own traditions and ways of doing things are emphasized. We find this style of conveying information through every aspect of Japanese learning and training. The Suzuki method of music training is one of listening and imitating, in which a child learns to play an instrument by picking it up, by listening, just as she learns a language. In the art of ikebana, or flower arrangement, for example, a teacher is far more likely to demonstrate how to arrange the flowers and then correct students' arrangements, rather than explain the theory or the history of the art. The same is true in archery and other martial arts. Skills are learned in a series of set movements, step by step, through the imitation of a master. All these differences aside, when working with the Japanese people, we also have to deal with the basic problem of the language barrier. Few non-Japanese people study Japanese, and although Japanese people study English for 6 years in school, many feel uncomfortable with spoken English, which is the language most commonly spoken with local employees in the offices of Japanese companies around the world. It's not easy to translate Japanese into English, and translation problems can lead to misunderstandings. For example, the encouraging phrase "ganbatte kudasai" in Japanese, meaning please do your best or you can do it, would be translated literally as please work harder, which has a completely different implication. To help bridge the language barrier, it's good to prepare agendas, avoid slang, pronounce words clearly, speak slowly, don't talk louder than normal, use visual aids such as diagrams, and write memos to confirm what has been discussed. Another issue is the style of written communication a person uses. When composing emails to Japanese colleagues, it is best to be as concise and polite as possible. Use lists, bullet points, section headings. Polish your draft to make sure it's easy to understand. Be formal and polite. Friendly, but not too personal. Many of us have become accustomed to the one-line email, the abbreviation-filled text message-like email that does away with pleasantries and goes straight to the point, but that typically doesn't work well when writing to Japanese people. Here is an example of a poorly written email. Just wanted to CK in with you, read the project. We are really under the gun here. Need to hear from you ASAP. Thanks. What is wrong with this email? A Japanese person is unlikely to understand the acronyms or slang here, ASAP, CK, under the gun, and it's so short as to be considered blunt or even rude. Your Japanese colleague is likely to be left feeling confused and disoriented by this kind of message. Here's the same email, rewritten in a more successful way. Dear Mr. Tanaka, thank you for your email of last Friday. I hope that you have been doing well. I'm sorry to bother you, but I'd like to follow up on the project status. Do you need any more information from us? We would very much appreciate it if a decision could be reached by the end of this week. Thanks so much for your assistance. Sincerely, Rachel Cook, Regulatory Approval Department. A polished and polite email like this one takes more time to compose, but the better response and clarity it will bring are well worth the effort. There is a well-known expression in Japanese, when you're in a hurry, take the long way round. Taking the extra time to make sure you are understanding your Japanese colleagues and they are understanding you is the best way to prevent problems and create a lasting relationship of mutual trust.